Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Reading. It's like being completely present and completely absent at the same time.
Hello, welcome to Sundaku, a podcast by reading addicts for reading addicts. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Cath Keneally. Annie, you are just back from an overseas holiday. Lots of reading?
Fair bit. Lots of trains, planes, buses. I'm not that good at reading on a bus. Quite a bit of distracting Spanish wine and food. But yes, I read my way around Spain. And Cath, you gave me a book before I left, which was such a page turner. I absolutely loved it. Being in Spain, of course, the shadow of the Civil War is still there, the shadow of Franco. You just keep wondering all the time, especially when you see elderly people, you know, you think they lived through that. And so I was full of curiosity. The book that you gave me was called The Whispering City, and it was set in Barcelona in 1952, and it was a translation, which was lovely because when you have a translation, you kind of understand how another culture is thinking as well. It was really fascinating, so thank you so much for that.
Pleasure. Well, interestingly, I don't know, we both must be on the Spain trip at the moment because I discovered a set of, I think I've read the 4 of them now, books by Chris LLoyd. He's a UK writer, but he seems to have lived in Girona for a long time. And he has a Catalan female police inspector as the main character in these books. And they're all set in Girona, and they certainly tap into hangovers from the Civil War and all sorts of Catalan politics, and also you get a very strong sense of what life is like now in those places with the influx of refugees, with, you know...
which is really obvious when you're there.
With the spillover from economic downturn in Spain, and I just really felt like being there. Chris LLoyd, City of Drowned Souls, I think is the first one, but look him up and read the lot.
I will. Sounds like a perfect excuse to go back, actually.
Yeah.
And today, though, you've had a chat with Vikki Wakefield.
I have. Vikki Wakefield. I came across her with her first book. It must be, 15 years ago now. And thought, oh, here's a talent, a local talent. And sure enough, she has gone on to do amazing stuff in the field of young adult writing. But now she's turned her considerable talent for young adult fiction to adult novels.
And I've seen it on airport shelves looking quite alluring.
Good.
After that, Andy Warhol. There's been a massive, that's 900 pages massive, recent biography written of that man who's credited with being a global culture changer. Our literary expert, Kylie Cardell, has actually read it, and we're going to find out how the shy son of working-class American immigrants went on to be mentioned in the same breath as Picasso and Van Gogh. And we'll leave it to you to decide whether he deserves that reputation.
Mm-hmm. And we have an Andy Warhol exhibition in our own
coincidentally
state gallery right this minute. And so, now to Vikki Wakefield, a young adult author whose books nearly all have gold stars on them for prizes that she's won. Her books for that demographic are very often dark and confronting, and she's turned her hand to adult fiction where the tone is very similar. Here's a chat I had with her right here in our studio a few weeks ago. Welcome to Sundaku, and thank you very much for being with us. I'm hoping that this morning we're going to be able to talk about your 2, I think, most recent books. This Is How We Change the Ending, which is a young adult book long-listed for the Stella Prize, a grown-up prize, and After You Were Gone, which is your first adult novel, supposedly. But you are a multi-award-winning author of young adult novels. Obviously, it's something you do well. After You Were Gone, I read that straight after This Is How We Change the Ending, and I certainly can't see that there's very much difference in the toughness of the content if that's how we judge the difference.
I'm often asked what did I change to be able to write for adults when I've been writing for young adults for quite some time. And the answer is very little in terms of my own style and voice. It's more related to content and perspective. So, if I'm writing from the young adult perspective, it's about things that are important to a teenager. And when I'm writing from an adult perspective, I can take hindsight a little bit further and wisdom. But, my adults make as many mistakes as my teenagers do. So
if we look at This Is How We Change the Ending, your main character is Nate McKeon. He's an ultra-smart boy, deeply pessimistic and with reason about his future. He lives in a dingy flat in Bearstall. We don't know quite where that is, near Rowley Park, and some of us who live in this city think, I think I know where you are. Mm-hmm. With a toxic male dad from hell called Deck, and a very lovely but hard-pressed young stepmum, Nancy, and her twins, so his half-brothers, one brain damaged in utero, and so they're both at home with Nancy, and nothing about his life is joyful or right. And I look to the back of your book, to what you said in the afterword, and you say, each book I write tends to colour life in some way, and this one was harder than the others. That's an interesting way to put it, because a lot of writers would put it the other way around, say life colours what I write. But you're saying that what you're writing seeps into your life and makes your life hard.
It comes from having revelations when you write, I think. And quite often when I'm writing, I'm asking myself questions and looking for answers to things that I may have experienced when I was younger. I don't know where it's going until it gets there. And then I go back and I realised the journey that I've taken and what direction the story took, and sometimes I realise why I wrote that story when I didn't know in the beginning. It makes me look at things that may have happened a long time ago and reassess and recalibrate, and often find some peace too. Often it's difficult too to go back over things that you may have seen or witnessed or experienced, and to find a way to tell them through story that arrive at a happy ending, because we know that life's really not like that. But if you can't have a happy ending, I hope that you can find peace and come to terms with things. So that in that way, yes, every book that I write draws out on an old story in some way, or old emotions and experiences. I think that's why my books are fairly intense, because they're intense for me to write. So I don't think you can go through the experience of telling the story and writing it that way without having those intense emotions too.
Mm. And this one was harder, in fact, than other ones.
It was difficult because I knew I was writing a story that really pushed the boundaries of YA in terms of age. I wouldn't call it gatekeeping so much anymore, because we really do allow them to experience a fair breadth of literature now, including reading adult literature in high school. So there's no reason why we wouldn't have confronting topics for young adults now. But this book really, I did not want it to tip over into an adult tone or perspective, and it was a very fine balance, because we're talking about a very grown-up young man who's experienced a lot and is on that tipping point between childhood and adulthood. So that was a bit of a tightrope.
As an adult reader, I was tremendously satisfied with the book, and I thought, how much further can you go, really? And you don't exclude too many things from this book on the basis of it being a YA book. So we've got violence, we've got poverty, we've got absolutely unrelieved stress for Nate every single day, undue responsibility that he has to carry, and he's isolated among his peers. He's got one good teacher, he's got one very good youth worker at the Youth, as they call the centre that they go to. And I found myself wondering, I wonder how this book's going to go down in posh schools. I thought, this is very much a book about kids of the underclass, and this is their lives. And for more sheltered kids with more opportunities, I wonder how they read a book like this and whether it comes as a shock.
The feedback I've had from some kids who acknowledge their own privilege and read a book like this is that it reads like a thriller. Because, you know, this is extreme stuff that they might see when they're watching Outer Banks or something like that. Teenagers living close to the edge and with very little adult input, and their lives seem free in some way. It's funny, I think there's still a disconnect between privileged teens and underprivileged teens in that they experience each other's lives vicariously through literature, and many teens will read young adult books that are squarely middle to upper class, you know, well-heeled schools and good education and all those kinds of things, which means they can go off on adventures because they can afford to. They have money. But when you're talking about teens that come from an underprivileged background, it's a different kind of adventure. It's more of a like, how am I going to survive today? I don't write books to teach anybody anything. I'm just writing what I know.
So tell us about that cast of misfits, really, who are Nate's peers, or at least the ones that reflect him back to himself in some way.
So Nate is 16, and I have set this book in Elizabeth area where I grew up in the northern suburbs, and people will recognise it. Nate's best friend Merrick lives in the same group of rental flats. He's quite an insular kid. He's just trying to keep his head down, not be noticed, stay out of trouble, get through high school. Simple needs. He just wants to get a job, just wants to earn some money, be independent. And he has a push-pull relationship with his own father, Dec, and his stepmother, Nance, who's only 8 years older than him. And he has a group of people that he knows through the youth centre. The youth centre gives him respite from home life, so he goes there. And during this story, that the youth centre comes under threat. So it's very much a book about choosing between belonging and survival, and choosing between belonging and resistance, because it's very difficult to have one and the other.
And some of the kids down the youth are leaning more in the direction of resistance, like his good mate who's the mural artist, who wants to use some of Nate's writing. Tell us about her. She's great.
Yeah, so we have Tash, who is a young artist who goes to the youth centre. She's been caught graffitiing a number of times, and she's banned. She can't buy paint. She can't access the things that she needs to tell her stories. And Nate writes things in his notebooks, and I think together the two of them could be a great team if they could get it together. It's not a romantic story in any way. It's all about allyship and Nate having to recognise who his allies are, despite the friction between the people who are trying to help him, and then recognising whose true enemies are. And in many ways, in this book, his biggest enemy is his own apathy, in that he thinks he can't change anything. And hence the title, This Is How We Change the Ending, is often about self and not so much about what's going on around you, the things you can't control, but changing the things that you can.
But Vikki, it's so hard to read because as you're reading, you're thinking, well, Nate, you're right. I see why you feel like that. His mum sends him down to the fish and chip shop to buy them chips for dinner every night, chips and white bread. That's it, because Dec...
He gambles and...
He takes the dope money.
He's growing in Nate's bedroom so that Nate has to share with his two half-brothers, And that's a realistic scenario in the burbs.
It seemed to me that way. And you think, well, where can he go? Because you certainly pricked the balloon of, education is the answer. This school is not going to save Nate. I think myself that his father, Dec, he's the key in a way to the novel. Nancy is confined and cowed by him, although she's very loyal. He's just a loose cannon about to go off any moment, and anyone with any experience of that will be absolutely on tenterhooks the whole way through the book, thinking he's going to explode. Something very bad is going to happen. And that's Nate's... It's his role model of fatherhood.
Absolutely it is. That's what manhood looks like to him, is his father, who he's grown up to reflect everything that he was brought up with. So he's essentially just following in the path that was laid out for him. He's not doing anything that we don't expect him to do. Dec is not a mystery.
No.
Dec doesn't need to be solved. It's a conflict for Nate too, because there's love in his father. He loves his kids, and he will state that repeatedly. And he stayed when Nate's mother left, which for him was an indication of how much he loved his kids, because he stayed.
As you say, Nate, in this book, he can't be allowed to have full adult insights because he's not a grown-up. That's where it's hard, I think, for you, the writer, and you do it just beautifully. You get into his head. I think his foil in the book is the gorgeous Nancy. Is she the one who has the tools to change the ending?
Without revealing any spoilers, Nance is capable of great things, as is Nate. And despite both their seemingly hopeless situations, that was the point of this book, I think, was to find a way for Nate to have some hope that was realistic, and that he could find something within himself to find some agency to change his own life when everything else seems like it's predetermined for him and he can't do anything about it. He figures out that he can.
All I will say is I adored the ending, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
How about we move on to After She Went? Now, this is your first adult novel. It's being billed as a psychological thriller, which it certainly is. What constitutes a psychological thriller, and how different did it feel writing this book to writing This Is How We Change the Ending?
Quite different, but I've been a crime fan for many years, so for me it was more like just changing gears really, and just finding a different way to tell a story. After You Were Gone, we call it a psychological thriller because for much of the book the menace is off page. It's that what's going on in the main character Abby's mind. She was a teenage mother. She has conflict within her own family, and Abby has a daughter, Sarah. She escapes her, she thinks, controlling mother's clutches and heads off into the world by herself with her daughter in tow. And at 6 years old, Sarah is abducted and taken. So there are 3 timelines in this book. There's before, which is before Sarah was born, during Abby's, when she was a teenager, which was a joy for me to write because obviously I'm very much in the teenager headspace. And then there's after Sarah was abducted with no sign of her for 6 years. Then there's now. So what is Abby going to do now? The book picks up really from the point where some good has come from her life. She doesn't know what's happened to her daughter, which is a terrible burden to live with. Very difficult to find peace. But she's married. She has 2 stepchildren. She's moving on with her life as much as she possibly can. But then she receives a phone call. She's had many phone calls over the years and many cranks and false ends. But this one is different. And the man basically says to her, if you wanted to know what happened to Sarah, you'll do what I say.
This is the tough stuff, and if this wasn't a book written by you, I probably wouldn't have read it, because reading about missing children is just where I draw the line.
You're not alone. There's a lot of people who said, Vikki, I love your work, but I can't read this book. And I understand.
But I'm glad I kept reading it. And one of the other things I thought was that in entering this territory, you're submitting yourself to certain genre rules to an extent. Certain things kind of have to happen, and the bad things that happen to Abby, they have to keep happening. And they keep happening and happening and happening, and you punish this poor girl so much. It was very difficult to read. I don't want to give too much away, but she's the subject of somebody's desire to punish her to the final degree.
Yeah, she's very much gets caught in something that she doesn't understand. She doesn't understand the motivation for it, but that will all become clear. I am bound by conventions with this book that writing for young adults seems to be so free. The one thing that binds young adults together is that they are for young adults. That's it. After that, you can go crazy. You know, you don't have to take one direction. You can start out with one story, end up with another, and it will still be fine because kids are really accepting of different stories. Writing crime fiction, the conventions are there. Generally, they have to be pacey. Things have to happen. and the stakes just rise with every chapter.
And you certainly bring that off. So we'll leave that all aside because that would be revealing too much. But one of the things I love about the book is that you take Abby back regularly to revisiting her early life, as you say, her young adult life in memory, and bringing her back to where she is now and trying to imagine what her state of mind would be living with this constant predicament of not knowing where her child is and trying to imagine how that would feel for her. And you make her say that she can see beauty all around her, but it's like having a floater in her eye. I just thought that was absolutely beautiful and probably about right.
Very much so. I don't think you can go through something like that and not be changed forever. You think of Emma Thompson in Love Actually when she says that how can you go through life knowing it will always be worse? It can't ever be better, which is the kind of thing that I think would happen with child abduction and specifically not knowing what happened. I think the not knowing part ties in with something called ambiguous loss, where it's very difficult to grieve and to draw lines in the sand and keep inching forward when you just don't know what happens, so that the closure is not there. Not knowing, I think, was one of my biggest fears. And I thought if I could write a story about that and explore it, then I could take a character through my own actions in some way. What would I do? And in the end, surprisingly, Abby took me on her own journey, and she's a pretty formidable young lady who is absolutely determined to find out what happened to her child, regardless of whether that means destroying the life that she's managed to build.
One of the commentators whose remarks appears at the beginning of the book says that you split open our ideas of friendship and family and you make us stress test our ideas of morality. I think that's true. She looks to her friends for backup.
I mean, after all, it is a fictional book and it's meant to entertain, but that doesn't mean that books can't ask big questions of people and put you in a position where you may agree or not agree with Abby's decisions, but either way, people work through things their own way, and sometimes our characters do what they want to do without asking.
And again, some of the best, I think, bits of the book are her early times where she moves out of her house. She's got that fractured relationship with her mum, and she moves in with Cass, who she thinks is her best friend. Cass is a bit of an unknown quantity and turns out to be not quite the support that she would have hoped that she would be. And the things that they do together, that's more in your young adult area. That just reads absolutely perfectly. The risks they take.
They do take a lot of risks, and funnily enough, Abby is quite risk averse. You don't realise that to begin with, but she's a bit of a fish out of water in her teenage years when she moves out of home for the first time. She's gone away from the safety of family and her parents, and suddenly she's out in the big wide world, and it's quite frankly terrifying. As she says early in the book, the fear was always there. She always was afraid. I guess that's one of the driving forces behind the decisions that she makes, is she's tired of being afraid. And so if you have the opportunity to find out what happened to your child, and also the rage that drives her too, that you took her from me and I'm coming for you.
So here you are at the end of having completed that one. I think it's going to do very well for you. Is this your path now?
No, I write a lot of stuff. I've got another young adult book. I'm just peddling away slowly with that one. Obviously, crime readers love to have books out quite regularly, which is a wonderful thing. I mean, I'm the same. If I have a writer that I love and I know there's another book coming soon, that's great. So I've got to keep doing that for a little while. But I'll keep writing for young adults as well. I hope I can have two distinct career paths with both, because they're both really important to me.
I wondered if I could ask you finally to find something that you'd like to read.
Yeah, I'll just do that first little, it's only a half page because it does sum up.
Okay, great.
When I was a child, I believed there was a place where lost things collected, the way sea drift found its way ashore to the same sheltered cove on our beach. I never knew if it was a story I'd heard or one I'd made up, but I could picture it clearly. A black hole where time stood still and the lost things lingered, Socks, shoes, purses, keys, missing pets, until people stopped looking for them and they faded from memory. After Sara was gone, I imagined her in that place, suspended, sleeping. Not knowing was like living inside a well with slippery sides and the occasional crack between stones, a foothold, a scrabbling place. I yearned for answers. I tortured myself going over the things I could have changed if only I'd been paying attention. After Sara was gone, I moved on, but I built my house around the well. While I was busy living, it sank deeper. The distance was greater, the light dimmer. This time the climb might be impossible, but I had no choice. I let myself fall. My life is a story in 2 parts, before, after.
Vikki Wakefield reading an excerpt from her first adult novel, After You Were Gone, out now from Text Publishing.
And now to Andy Warhol. Was he a joke or a genius, a radical or a social climber? That's the question that arts critic Blake Gopnik set out to answer in his massive biography of the man. I spoke to our regular literary expert, Kylie Cardell, about her take on this 900-plus page tome. Hi, Kylie.
Hi, Annie.
Andy Warhol, what comes to mind? I mean, obviously soup cans, screen prints of Marilyn Monroe in strange colours. What comes to mind when we think of Andy Warhol?
Oh, I mean, I think that's a wonderful question. And for me, it's a leather-jacketed, turtleneck-wearing, silver wig, beatnik-looking dude. Or maybe dude's not a good word, actually, for Andy Warhol, because he also has a very fey, feminine kind of side to him. Andy Warhol is hard to pin down. I think we know a lot about his art. He's very divisive in the art world, and debates continue to rage about, was he a good artist or was he just lucky? I think that the fact that his work has been so commercially successful has meant that for many art critics, it kind of belies the idea of fine art. And so he's kind of at this place where pop culture enters into art consciousness and his own capacity to be such a memorable figure. I think most people would have an idea of who Andy Warhol is. They'd conjure the Marilyns, they'd conjure the soup cans, they'd maybe conjure the Technicolor cows. They might think of his films. They might never have watched them, but they might know that Andy Warhol made a film that durated for 5.5 hours of his lover sleeping. Or that he filmed the Empire State Building from a fixed camera for 8.5 hours.
And he made people watch these films too.
Oh yeah, I mean they were in cinemas, and you can watch them. You can stream them from the Andy Warhol Museum. So again, that might tell you something about Andy Warhol. He curated his own legacy in very, very strong ways. He was not only a prolific artist, but he documented immense detail elements of his life. So he's almost irresistible for biographers, I think. But this is the first really comprehensive biography of him.
And they say that to really understand Andy Warhol, you've got to see him as a narrative, as a story, not any particular aspect of him. But he's certainly a key figure, isn't he, in where things flipped from
absolutely
old art to new art, apart from many other things.
His high point is the 1960s, and in America, and obviously America is a very important cultural flashpoint for a lot of us in the world. 1960s art, contemporary art, is field defining. Everything kind of shifts after that point, and we have a new perspective on what art should be and what it can do and what it should look like and how it could be made. To that point, really, the art is artisanal, single-authored, handmade product. And Andy Warhol really, really challenges that notion. He brings in mass production. He brings in, the factory is not an actual factory, but he brings in the idea of multiple makers, that he has the idea, which is not a new idea, but it's new in terms of he's being very overt about it. And that the art is not necessarily only made by him, is a kind of radical idea for audiences, not for artists, because of course Renaissance artists had teams of people working on their art as well. So, yeah.
So this biographer, Blake Gopnik, is an art critic, obviously had a huge job. Did I read 100,000 documents he had to go through?
I mean,
went through everything from the laundry list, to the letters, to whatever he could lay his hands on.
It's a huge project. There's an entire museum dedicated to Warhol, and it's filled with the things that he left, that he documented. He was a almost compulsive, I would say, documenter of his own life. And everything that he did document, he incorporated into his projection of this is art, now this is art, right? So one of the famous ones is the time capsules. And there's over 600 shoeboxes, archive-sized shoeboxes. And he would just periodically kind of sweep everything off his desk into one of the shoeboxes and label it time capsule. And this is an art object now.
I love that idea.
And there's over 600 of these, including, apparently, food, which causes the archivists no end of trouble because how are you supposed to preserve rotting organic matter? But also receipts, ticket stubs, detritus of his everyday life.
It sounds like his version of tidying up.
Probably was. And he was always tax deductible. He's a very canny businessman, Andy Warhol, and once you call it art, then you can claim it.
So why do you think Blake set out to do this, Blake Gopnik, and what is he trying to achieve, and what did he achieve?
Yeah, well, as an art critic, Blake Gopnik brings a real expertise to this material. He's written mostly for newspapers. I don't think he's been an academic as such. So he's kind of been an art critic who's worked, in terms of translating art for audiences. And Andy Warhol's probably a pretty interesting figure to do that for. So Blake Gopnik, I think, comes at this with a passion for Andy Warhol. I think he really, really likes his art. And in fact, one of the things he wants to address is a perception that Andy Warhol was almost an accidental or a product of his time, when in fact Blake Gopnik wants to show he's a very, very canny, sophisticated, driven artist, and that he's very, very, very precise about all the things he's doing, because his public persona is this kind of fey, giggly artist who can't put words together, is a terrible interview subject, often says, oh, my assistant could answer that for you better than I could. He's a really he seems inept. Blake Gopnik wants to sort of say that is also an artwork, which is an interesting idea, but that Andy Warhol was a genius in terms of creating his own identity as part of his art. And the reason he does that, the reason he comes across as this kind of fey, country bumpkin kind of ignorant character, Blake Gopnik says, is to let you look harder at the art. He kind of wants to absent himself a little bit to say, look at what the art does. Why do you think this is interesting? Or why would Campbell's soup cans be an appropriate subject matter?
So do you think he's saying that Warhol had an artistic heart as opposed to just taking advantage of the times?
Yeah, because the popular opinion is he was selling out or commercial, right? Sure, but he's extremely successful at doing that. And he has a career of art practice that includes incredibly detailed, difficult kinds of mediums that he's worked with. So Blake Gopnik, I think, wants us to know that Andy Warhol is a genius, and he's been underestimated by audiences and art critics. And obviously in the world that Blake Gopnik moves in, which is an art critic world, that's a little bit of a controversial idea still. Pop art still has a really uncertain place. And people will go to, still say, sure, but there's also fine art, and there's also, better kinds of art. So pop art still has this really uneasy place. And I think mostly because people understand that there's a commercial aspect to it, that one of the things we might be asked to be thinking about in relation to art is, well, why is it worth what people say it is? Why would you pay money for art? Why is this one worth, an Andy Warhol sold in 2009 for $100 million?
Do you think Blake's account of Andy Warhol's life is going to up those prices even more?
Oh, yeah, actually I do. Because he's really actually enshrining him as he's being very careful to trace his career, show all the careful ways in which he negotiated with the different currents of his time. So absolutely. I think one of the things that biography can do actually, of course, is authorise a kind of life. And so politicians always want their biography written only by biographers that they nominate, though. And people, when you've got a biography written about you, you're kind of a proper, serious figure. There was a biography of Andy Warhol by Wayne Kostenbaum, but you'd think for such an amazing kind of well-known celebrity icon that it would be more. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Blake Gopnik thinks Andy Warhol is great, and he's serious about how he talks about him, and he's serious about how he understands what he was up to and his practice. And I think that will influence people to also see more about what Blake Gopnik sees in Warhol, and the other art critics, and obviously the art market to some degree is always known.
So do you think that Gopnik's got to the real heart of this mysterious man? He really was quite a strange one. Or do you think he's just added to the myth?
You can't help but add to a myth. And I don't know. We will never know if biography of any kind can get to the heart of their subject. Certainly, this is a very traditional biography in lots of ways. It's extensively researched, as you mentioned. Gopnik interviews dozens and dozens, I want to say almost hundreds, I'm not quite sure, but there's so many people who he interviews personally, people who knew Andy. He opens the book with a famous incident in Andy Warhol's life where he has been shot by the feminist activist Valerie Solanas. And it's a really, a tragic, terrible moment. Gopnik opens the book with this moment of possible death, with a detailed account of the operation that the surgeons have carried out. He interviewed the surgeons, the surgeon who actually performed that operation. And so, it's this kind of detail from witnesses, if you like, of Andy's life really gives it a depth. Whether or not we then still know who the real Andy Warhol is, I don't think that's possible. But I think you get a real picture of who he was at his moment and who he was to people around him, and a deeper picture of the impact he had on the culture and society he lived in, absolutely. It's 976 pages. It's chronological, apart from that one kind of opening, which he opens with that scene, which is in the middle of Andy's life, where he's been shot. And it goes right through to his very early death, actually, when he was only 59, in the late 80s.
And his death was quite unexpected too.
His death was unexpected. Possibly, and this might be why Blake Gopnik rhymes the opening and ending, possibly complicated by that gunshot wound. So Andy Warhol actually died from a routine gallbladder operation. He suffered from, gallbladder all his life, and he had an operation at 59 to solve this. And the surgery went wrong. He went through the surgery, but afterwards died in hospital. And that was kind of shocking. It was a very routine, it shouldn't have been a very
ordinary death for somebody who looms so large. How was his death received at the time? Does Gopnik go into that?
Yeah, he absolutely does. There was huge outcry, actually. He was a very famous figure, and he'd just sort of begun televising, like broadcasting television shows, very odd television shows. I mean, the amount of work that Warhol did. He was definitely lauded or just noticed, right? A very, very important figure in popular culture, and there was a mass outpouring, and it was such a tragic, unexpected end in lots of ways. So, yeah, Gopnik gives us cradle to grave in this biography, and he goes into immense detail. I never found it wearying. I found it incredibly interesting, and that, I think, is a testament to the biographer's capacity to bring his critical eye to it. He is doing that odd thing of reading the artist through his work, which we don't always accept in critical circles. We sort of say the author must be seen as separate to the art. But in the case of Andy Warhol, I think Gopnik proves you have to see Warhol himself as participating in his mythologization and participating in the creation of his persona. And so you need to see his life in relation to the art. And this biography is a deep dive into exactly how Warhol did that.
Associate Professor of Literature at Flinders University, Kylie Cardell, she was talking there about the Andy Warhol biography by Blake Gopnik. Read it if you dare, 900 pages.
This is Sundoku, the podcast for anyone whose bedside book pile has taken on a life of its own.
And we'd love to hear from you. If you're keen to share your reading habits and your reading past and give us a glimpse of your Sundoku, send us a voice memo to sundokukast@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Cath Keneally. Catch you next time. This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Sarah Martin,
Annie Hastwell,
Michaela Andreev,
And me, Cath Keneally. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to find out more about the books and authors featured in this program, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast, which is TSUNDOKU cast.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.